Good morning, everybody. Welcome to this session. We're going to be looking at collaborative behaviours in procurement today. I'm going to cover that in the next sort of 30 to 40 minutes. So sit back, have your cup of tea. If you have a Danish or something to jump on, then please do that. My name is Helen Carter. I work for Action Sustainability. We are the delivery partners for the Supply Chain Sustainability School, and I'm lead consultant in the organisation, focusing mainly on sustainable procurement, modern slavery, human rights, which is a real cacophony of things, a real mix. But I would say my underlying passion is supply chains and procurement. So hopefully going to give you a bit of an overview of what really the world of procurement is evolving into at the moment around this sort of collaborative behaviours piece. So hopefully you can all see my screen okay. What we are going to cover today is a session focusing on that, and because this is a webinar, obviously all your cameras are switched off and all your background noise is on, it's off, so that's been switched off and muted. If you do have questions as we're going through, I will bring them all to the end more than likely, so if you can just pop them into the Q&A, I will capture all the questions at the end. There's no such thing as a stupid question, so if there's something you want to ask, please feel free to. We are going to use Mentee as we always do, so if you're familiar with these webinars that we've been running for a few years now, then please make sure you've got access to Mentee either through the app on your phone, or if you utilise www.mentee.com, and I will let you know the code as soon as we're ready to dive into that. We will circulate around the slides, so I'll be sending this through to Jenny, who's in charge of the registration after today's session, and also we are recording this, so you will get a link as well to the recording. If you find anything useful that you feel you want to share with some of your colleagues, please feel free to. So this session is part of the wider Productivity Through Procurement programme that you'll be familiar with. We run a whole series of events and workshops and e-learning, learning journeys, everything contained in the school. It's been designed by the school, King's College, the Institute for Collaborative Working, which is why we've got the key elements here, and we've utilised materials from organisations like SIPS, who are obviously quite prolific in the procurement world. You will get your CPD accreditation at the end of all of this, as you do with all the sort of webinars and registrations that you can do. And the way I picture the sort of collaboration world at the moment is this is what I sort of call the high-end element of procurement. So I liken our course, if you like, to an elevator. So we run in this area introductions to procurement, how you do plant and materials procurement, subcontracting, up to things like supplier relationship management, and the top end is where we start to talk about collaboration, even though you could really argue that it's probably the foundation of really good procurement anyway. So what are we going to cover in the session for this one? We're going to initially look at what collaboration is, what collaborative cultures and behaviours look like. We'll then dive quickly into some key tools and techniques that you need to think about. We'll have a look at the barriers and how you can overcome them. And I'll finish off with a little bit of a case study on how some of what I've talked about over the sort of 30 minutes beforehand has been put into practice, and some of the key benefits that the Environment Agency, for example, has managed to replicate from there. So what we'll do is we'll start off, as always, with the definition. What do we mean when we talk about collaboration, when we talk about collaborative cultures? So if you can get your Mentee app ready, and if you look at your screen, you will see there's a code, and it's 47431022. So that's 47431022. If you can see the chat, I will pop that in there for you. I know you can't use the chat to speak, but you should be able to see the information in there. Brilliant, we've got some people in there already. And the key is basically, how would you define collaboration? So a nice little word bubble to start with, some key things that you think are important or make up collaboration. So we've already got somebody who talks about open-mindedness. I like that. Mutual. Yeah, we're going to talk a lot about that a little bit later on in terms of mutual outcomes, mutual objectives. Shared benefits, I like that. It's about sharing the outcomes, success for all rather than success for some. Beneficial, common goal, working together, that's a few times. Partnership, yes, definitely going to be one of the key things that we will go through when we talk about the relationships in procurement, starting to look at more of a partnering arrangement, partnership type of arrangement. Brilliant. Working together really strong, teamwork really strong. Communication, quite not as strong as I thought it would be, but yes, a big key must for good collaborative behaviour. Clear, concise communication, something sometimes I struggle with. Synergies, yeah, 360 reviews. Friendly, I like that. Culture of friendliness, mutual trust. Win-win, yeah, that's an interesting one in procurement. When I started my procurement training quite a few decades ago, it was the basic 101 of good negotiation, looking at win-win situations. So creating that culture is really, really important. Okay, two-way dialogue, that links in nicely with the 360 degrees. Okay, some really expressing ideas. Yeah, no idea is a stupid idea, which is always really important. Okay, brilliant. Don't close that down because we will be going back to mentee. Oh, hang on, no, sorry, ignore that. One more before we go back. So if I was to say, think about your own organisation, think about opportunities that you have in your organisation around collaboration. How well do you think you do this at the moment? So we don't. We have a good relationship with our internal parties, so we collaborate nicely with those. We might collaborate nicely with internal parties and clients. We might collaborate nicely with internal parties and supply chain partners. If you're really good, you might collaborate up and down the value chain, so with clients and with so downstream and upstream with your supply chain. I haven't got a clue if it's too early in the Friday for this question. That's not a problem at all. So really interesting to see the results coming through on here. So what we're seeing is, I actually, when I put these questions together, would have expected the 5 to be a little bit higher, to be honest. A lot of collaboration with clients, maybe possibly expecting that to be a little bit higher with the supply chain. So it's really good that we're seeing the supply chain being particularly high as well. I think the aspiration and where we start to see the case study later on in terms of the Environment Agency, but also where we're seeing things like the A14, is that upstream and downstream. So actually collaboration on a project level where you've got clients, principal contractors, tiers of supply chains truly collaborating together is sort of like the ideal of where you want to be able to get to. Okay, brilliant. So I will now go to my slides. So when we want to look at behaviours around collaboration, let's look initially at what we mean truly by collaboration. So as I mentioned, the organisation called the Institute of Collaborative Working has been influential in putting a lot of this training course together, and they really do provide a lot of good case studies and good information on how to do it. And as they are the experts in this space, they provided a really good definition of people working jointly on an activity or a project to achieve a common goal. And then obviously go on to talk about cooperation between teams, cooperation between departments and different organisations. So I think the key things in this definition to extract out, and you've picked it up in the word bubble that we saw at the beginning, was the common goal. This is not about individual organisations trying to achieve their own goals, although good collaboration means that individual goals can be achieved through achieving those common goals. So a connection between the both is ideal. And also looking at different organisations sometimes as well. So not just an internal thing between departments. To a certain extent, we do that most times in our organisations, but looking at externally as well, different organisations on how we can bring that in. So it's quite an interesting definition, not quite as simple as you think. And I think what builds on that is King's College. So King's College have created a lot of the e-learning modules for us around this, and particularly into things like forms of contract, bringing BIM in to how you do collaboration. And they do actually have a definition that then starts to bring it in terms of more construction focused. So here we're talking about collaborative construction procurement, providing that timely build-up and exchange of accurate data between team members in order to integrate their work, align their objectives, and create improved outcomes. So it builds a little bit more on that definition that came through from ICW. And again, you've got some alignment with aligning objectives. So it is this idea of common goals again, common outcomes. But I think what's also kind of interesting in this definition is that issue of data, accurate data. So there's a lot of discussion around tools like BIM, for example, that are methods and tools that can be used to help foster collaboration, and forms of contract that foster collaboration. And what's also kind of interesting about this definition is the improved outcomes. So it doesn't immediately go cost savings, it goes improve outcomes. And that could align whether it's cost savings, cost avoidance, whether it could be looking at value, depending on how you want to be able to define that. So all of this sounds kind of idyllic, and it's sort of like the aspiration of what you're trying to achieve, but there has been some research done on this, and King's College again have put some really interesting statistics together, some really interesting case studies together on work they've done with key pilot projects on how to drive collaborative behaviours. And what they found is pretty much common sense, but now is sort of supported with research, that we start to see a better and improved value outcome when we start to look at collaborative procurement. If we're ever thinking the need to be more collaborative is important, now is that time, as we start to see the supply chain pressures that we're experiencing, and we're starting to see improved value, whether it's cost avoidance, whether it's better project management, coming because we are collaborating with supply chains to be able to allow us to achieve these challenges going forward. And when we talk about value, value means different things to different organizations. So it's a key thing when we're thinking about behaviors and when we're thinking about the culture we're trying to instill, is that clear definition of what value means in the situation you're in. So is the value you're looking to try and bring related to sustainability outcomes, carbon reduction, or social value, or is value really just about trying to ensure that you can get your project delivered on time with some legacy benefits? So defining that value is really, really important, because it provides you with that common goal. So if we're looking at that as collaboration, what does culture do to enable us to be able to deliver that? So I've got a little video that can help you with some of those thinkings.
Competitive advantage gained through collaboration is very difficult to replicate because successful collaboration depends on culture and relationships, not just processes and systems. So, what can you do to support the building of a collaborative culture? Here are 5 tips. First, take the lead in using communication and collaboration tools to enable your teams to share information, build networks, and keep information flowing. Second, role model collaborative behaviors such as knowledge sharing and side-by-side problem solving. Third, demonstrate openness on diverse teams. Help explore differences and how they could help generate new insights and creativity. Fourth, help your teams develop their own culture by working with them to create core operating agreements and shared norms. Finally, develop metrics that reinforce collaborative behaviors. What gets measured and rewarded drives change. Collaboration in a group can happen by chance, but relying on chance alone is not enough. Collaboration is often hard work and needs leaders who can help make it happen.
So when we're talking collaboration here, what we're talking about is a lot of those aspects that we've just seen in that video, but also a huge range of elements that need to reinforce that. So we see things like behaviours. One of the most interesting supplier days back in the old days when we were looking at supply chain schools and doing face-to-face was listening to Ben Cross, who was talking about the work that happened on the A14. How did they reinforce some of the behaviours? And it wasn't perfect, they made lots of mistakes, but they also did some really innovative ideas on selecting supply chain through their behaviours, not just through price, and then reinforcing those behaviours in meetings through those codes of conduct, and being able to feel like you can empower individuals to call out individuals or companies that were not acting in terms of the behaviours that have been agreed. So ensuring that we understand that everyone has got that code of conduct, what is acceptable, what is not, and having the brave conviction to be able to pull people up when they're not actually behaving in the way you've agreed. Making sure that actually you've got this single purpose. Now, what we're talking about when we talk about collaborative cultures isn't about sort of everybody giving up their individual identity from an organizational perspective. Individual organizations have their own requirements, but it's about trying to find a way that the project they're working on, or the program or the supply chain contract that they're working on, has a common goal everyone can sign up to, and obviously allows individual organizations to achieve their own requirements as well. So it creates that win-win situation that you're looking for. Working in consensus to develop the plans and solve problems. I've worked on rail projects before where it's been embedded into contracts where you will all work in accordance with 44,001, you'll all collaborate, and then when it gets down to the coal face, it's, yeah, you'll collaborate by doing what we tell you. So actually harmonizing the groups, making sure that everybody is working aligned, working to those conditions, and everybody's voice is heard is really important, which then encourages involvement, encourages everybody to come to the table and talk about what they can do to make sure that the projects work significantly more efficiently or effectively or towards that common goal. Working as a team is also really important. So sometimes you're not going to get on, and I really enjoyed on that bubble some of the comments you made about friendly. Trust is another thing that needs to go on. Sometimes it falls down. So true collaboration is not reverting to type and reverting to contract mitigation, but to actually, how do we mediate these issues? How do we deal with solving the issue that doesn't disadvantage anybody involved in that process? I'm not even going to begin to try and say that word, I always struggle with it. But we basically need to share information and actually expect that you share information the other way. So this mutual relationship that you're expecting, it is that openness, that trust environment. And sometimes in construction that can work really, really well. But sometimes if you haven't brought the right supply chain on or worked with the right supply partnerships and encouraged the right behaviours, things like that can actually make a big negative impact if not undertaken properly. Don't be siloed on what the solution is as well. So think about what alternative solutions might be. So again, it's that flex that you're looking for, which we do actually do quite well sometimes in construction. You know, whether it's a big project that we're working on or a complex subcontract package, we're always being flexible in the way that we can deliver those. So keeping that process going whilst looking at those common goals is really, really important. And trying to head off any issues, engaging proactively where things might be changing or there might be needs to address some of those issues, rather than just, yeah, we think it might go right, let's just wait and see, which is obviously what we don't really want to do. So the reality around sort of collaborative behaviours sometimes is that a lot of it is just common sense. It's sort of psychology of how we deal with people, and it's creating that environment of trust and thinking about what really does allow projects to be collaborative on a regular basis. So if we were to look at key things that you'd expect to do, you need to look at leading by example. There is nothing worse, as I mentioned, that example when I was working on a rail project, where the client says that they want you to be collaborative, and then fundamentally all their behaviours just completely go against what they've asked for. They take that domineering approach, they don't collaborate, they don't listen to examples that are coming through. So needing to lead by example, not just at the top, but also within the middle areas and individuals. So the A14 example I gave you of where individuals were called out in meetings for behaviours that were not acceptable is really important. Focusing on those benefits from collaboration is also really key, but not just organisational benefits, but individual benefits. There's a lot of personal pride individuals can take from working on a collaborative growth that they can get. So thinking about all the benefits that can be created from a collaborative project can enhance both individual progress, but also organisational and then ultimately project benefits. What the behaviour is really, really, really key. It's what makes or breaks collaboration. So what is behaviour? What is the activity you're expecting? If somebody is designed to be transparent, if somebody is not giving you information that they've agreed to be able to share, if somebody sat in a room and pointed a finger at another supplier because they are the ones at fault, and try to shift blame, which we know sometimes can happen on construction projects. So making sure that we are reinforcing that open behaviour, that trust and transparent behaviour is really, really key. Making sure that we understand where collaboration is part of the daily life. And again, we have lots of places and gateways, whether you happen to be looking at value engineering, whether you happen to be looking at the beginning of the procurement process, understanding the market. Where do we really want to see collaboration go in? The example that I gave you from the A14 was really interesting because they built behaviour analysis into pre-qualification. So working with suppliers on that project and selecting them not just by competency and capability, i.e. the processes that the lady said in the video, but also the cultural norms of what that organisation would do. So really interesting case study on work they did with team building through the pre-qualification, bringing in some of the partner organisations and testing out how some of the key individuals working on the project would behave. So really trying to get underneath to see what's really happening rather than what's on a paperwork document. Employees need a voice. What can they actually provide? So ensuring that they have a voice, creating that supportive environment. No idea is a stupid idea. Whether you're senior or whether you're junior, everyone has got the ability to influence the successful outcome. Seems kind of ideal, but idealistic, but the reality is that sometimes the greatest ideas can come completely out of left field. Somebody who's just seen something from the outside. So making sure that we're understanding when we're working with stakeholders that we get that good cross function, everybody feels comfortable and empowered to have that conversation. Persistence is going to be key. Sometimes this is really changing the dynamic. It's really changing the sort of trust position. So adaptation, evolution. Don't be frightened to get it wrong. I think it's one of the key things in most things that we talk about in the school. So adapt, evolve, change, lessons learned. And the case study that I'll show you at the end from the Environment Agency has got some great lessons learned. What didn't quite work well? What do they need to be able to do? But fundamentally, we all know that a lot of the things that we gripe about constantly when we're working in procurement or when we're working in projects is constantly the fact that if we could just talk to people and work with them, all our lives would be a lot easier. So there's an acknowledgement that collaboration makes not just the world a better place, a nice ideal, but makes our lives easier to a certain extent in terms of outcomes. So these are key things that we need to understand. There's sort of behaviours, if you like, key things that you'll need to take away to your organisations, work with your key suppliers and your key partners. If you're a client, thinking how you embed those in. But obviously there's a lot there. So let's go back to the mentee poll and tell me what you think rank these in terms of what you think are the most important. So if you were going back to your project, if you were going to be or going back to your organisation and working with some key suppliers, where would you see this sort of scale of behaviours, if you like, in terms of the most important for you and obviously then the least important? It always takes a little bit longer because you've got to rank this time. Yes, this is where I get to see it. Yeah, lead by example. Okay, so we've got one person put that in so far. Integrate it into the organisational workflow. Acknowledge that collaboration improves everything. Interesting that lead by example slips a little bit further down. It's gone back to the top. Create a supportive environment. So there's a lot of softer skills there in terms of influencing people's behaviours. But it's not surprising to see that lead by example sits at the top here. When I do a lot of work around sustainable procurement and we look at change management and we look at the ways that we can really embed changes necessary, the key thing is the leadership. Making sure that, and when I say leadership, by the way, I'm not just talking about, you know, your project directors or your MDs or your senior management, the middle layers, but we're talking then about leadership at all levels, leadership through behaviours, not just leadership through hierarchy. Creating that supportive environment, yes, definitely is a really important one. And I think if we are looking for that behaviours and that trust that needs to go in and that people feel empowered to make those decisions, they need to feel like they get it wrong and they make a mistake, or they ask a silly question, that they're entitled to do that, and that nobody's going to pull them up on it. So yeah, I think that leads quite nicely into the behaviours piece as well. Interesting that the focus on benefits is low, is the bottom there. I suppose it's because you're ranking them, but a lot of what I'm seeing here is you all talking about the fact that it's, I suppose the benefits will come at the end once you've embedded a lot of these key aspects into your projects and your programs. Okay, brilliant. So let me just go back. Okay, so we know what we want the culture to look like. We know what we need to do in terms of collaborative outcomes is what we're looking for. So realistically, what we need to think about is how we embed collaboration in procurement models. So how do we ensure that when we procure, whether it happens to be a client at the top level, or whether it happens to be a tier one that's procuring a massive work package, even sort of tiers 2s and 3s, collaboration can exist all the way through the supply chain, either up and down or in small pockets. So the reality is that if you are going to do this, we need to understand how to do it effectively, and embedding it in your procurement model is really important. So there are contracts like JCT, for example, that do promote and support collaborative behaviours, and there are also lots of types of models of procurement now that really start to understand the terms and conditions of contracts that either discourage or encourage collaborative behaviours. So traditional old models where we start to look at penalties and failures to comply and what happens to go onto those contracts are not contracts that allow us to deliver that collaborative behaviour. So it's about trying to ensure that what we've got in place incentivises the supply chain in this area and not disincentivises them. So enabling clarity of purpose is really important. So in your procurement models, the things that you're doing, who is responsible for what in those contracts? It's not about making it prescriptive, but it's about ensuring that everybody really understands the role they play within this collaboration that you're working on. And it's ensuring that we start to provide that clarity of purpose. Making sure that contractual commitments are clear, but at the same time not too prescriptive. So it is a real nuance in the way that we change some of the contracts. So when we look at Environment Agency, when we look at the A14, we start to see some really interesting dynamics in the contracts that they put in place. So for example, the A14, there was a lot of transparent pricing. There was a lot of contractual agreements that encouraged plant organisations to collaborate amongst themselves. Making sure that there are shared objectives and targets, and that's across the programmes that they're working on. But again, it's that win-win situation. So it's ensuring that the contracts support all that. And then obviously, as I said earlier, a lot of traditional contracts do tend to have this penalty as a way to deal with conflict. If you fail to do, your penalty will be. So what's the mechanism to avoid those conflicts or avoid those problems in the first place? So this is where we do get into mediation. You don't want the contract so woolly that nobody really knows where the responsibility is, but you do need it specific enough to make that clarity, but you don't want it so prescriptive that there is no flexibility in giving that. A good way to look at it is incentivization. So making sure that you do have ways that exceptional performance can be rewarded. But the key here is that for every contract you put in place, every procurement model that you're looking for involves all the key stakeholders. So not just relying on the contract, but also relying on that behaviour amongst the procurement activity. So things that you can also think of from a collaborative perspective are looking at that sort of, what are we trying to achieve, that optimum collaboration that we're going for. So when an organisation works with a supply chain and offers lots of ideas and visions on what to do, you end up with that optimum collaboration. That's your aspiration. What you can do to do that, support that, is to use technology. So we mentioned BIM. That's a great way of doing it, but sharing ideas. Now, these days, it's so easy to create technology that everyone can then feed into, whether it's sharing documentation, sharing networks, using BIM, sharing ways to process payments, whatever it is. Looking for collaborative buying groups. So again, we start to see where you may have problems in your supply chain that individual links in the supply chain can't really address. But if you collectively bring the supply chain together, then actually how do we bring collaborative buying groups into play? So that's a good way of looking at it. It seems to be the holy grail that's been spoken about in construction for decades. I think I first heard it in the 90s, but earlier contractor involvement. And I know that through things like the Green Book and the government playbook, for example, we still are trying to get that ECI involvement in procurement going forward. And that really is about driving the collaborative behaviour. Looking at things like 44001, it's a standard that supports collaboration, and if used properly, really starts to drive collaborative thinking, ideas to become more efficient, obviously as long as it's not used as a tick box exercise. So utilising things like the standard to drive collaborative behaviours and using workshops is a great way of doing it. And then not forgetting things like supplier performance and supplier relationship management. It's really interesting when I deliver a lot of the training, and my colleague Mel delivers a lot of the training, the SPM and the SRM that is still not really utilised significantly in a lot of the construction projects that we see on a regular basis. So utilising those is really important. There is a link on here, and there'll be a few links that you'll be able to access when you get the slides. So there's actually an online capability assessment that you can undertake that looks at how well you think you can collaborate, how you have the capacity to do this. So it's worth having a look at that to determine what your strategy would be. The key, though, is that what we're looking for around this is to ensure that our supply chains need to collaborate. We have an adage that we use a lot in procurement, whereas your supply chain and your procurement are only as successful as your weakest link. So it's really important now more than ever, as we deal with inflationary prices, as we deal with challenges with ethical procurement, as we deal with carbon challenges, skills, labour, all of these things are now starting to affect our organisations and our projects and our industries and productivity and efficiency. And only by collaborating either as a supply chain or amongst other organisations can we deal with this. And I think it was about 3 or 4 years ago, Mark Farmer issued a document called Modernise or Die. And basically he talked about the fact that what you have to do is work collaboratively and avoid inappropriate risk transfer. So by working collaboratively, you can address risk at the right place in your supply chain, rather than doing what we lovingly call risk dumping into all the various aspects of the supply chain. So collaborating amongst contractors, suppliers, manufacturers, operators, stakeholders that might be external to the project that you're working on can feel quite cumbersome. And obviously you don't want to be collaborating on everything you do, but in those key areas where you really need to address that value, really need to come out with some benefits over and above cost efficiency almost, then it's a must to do. So what I'm going to do is just play you a very quick video on a success that's worked really well in this area.
Prater's remit was the fabrication, installation of all of the structural steelwork and the roof canopy, including the cladding to that, along with the installation of precast concrete platform sections, glazing elements such as the north and south lights to the eyebrow canopies, roof safety systems. A total collaborative approach was generated between ourselves, Costain and Network Rail. We were fortunate for an early involvement to help develop the design before it reached the site phase. We were fortunate that the client was prepared to invest in building a full-size prototype to enable everybody to see what they were getting themselves into, but to prove that it could be built in time and to a good quality. This is a very difficult project to deliver over a period of almost 5 years, and it had to have a team approach to it. The success of the unitised delivery system, we put multiple elements into lifting frames, so one lift with a tower crane lifted up 5 or 6 elements at a time to speed up install. We've had to work basically 24/7 with multiple teams. Key possessions have been planned months in advance and fine-tuned, so that every hour that we are given to have access to the work front, we've taken advantage to. Because of the way that we built an awful lot of the canopy off-site, it's been done in a very safe manner, working on the ground rather than a height, and has resulted in 5 years over 650,000 man hours without any serious incident, and it's a credit to all of the teams.
Particular challenges with the Eurosafe packages were to do with the cradle system for the eyebrows. They turned out to be very, very bespoke to the job because of the geometry of the roof, the soffit, and there's a number of trades that are going to have to use them. So it was accommodating everybody's wishes into one package. It's a very, very complex site. There's a lot of things to do and people really do need to talk. I think being involved in the project very early with Prater and being involved with as many design meetings and coordination meetings as possible has ensured that that's happened.
One of the greatest successes here at London Bridge has been some of the concepts that we've been able to use, particularly around off-site manufacturing and being prepared to complete the job in relatively short timescales. Some of the work we've done with Prater and their supply chain to manufacture cassette units for canopies and modularised glazing units, etc., have really made a difference to be able to deliver a quality product here and get it right first time.
To complete achieving the highest results that we've achieved on the project really just amplifies the excellent support the Prater team has delivered to Network Rail and Costain, and equally commends the performance from Costain enabling us to achieve the right conclusion. It's an absolute superb result to come out of the project with a blue standard and the highest score.
Having been involved with Prater since an early contractor stage, we've managed to form really strong relationships right throughout our organisations, and that's enabled success throughout the project.
So they made that look easy, didn't they? But the reality is that you wouldn't be here if there weren't some barriers or some challenges on how we address these issues. So one final question then on mentee. Again, go back to the word cloud. What would you say in your experience are the biggest barriers to collaboration? So what are the biggest challenges that you're experiencing? Quality. So, quality of suppliers, I'm assuming tight margins, time, ego. Yeah, definitely. Poor communication, timelines, closed-mindedness, different KPIs, politics, organizational culture, no clear objective, different KPIs, yet we're seeing data, not necessarily having all that data. Costs being one of those issues that we have. Okay, tools and facilities. More. Varied skills, yep, knowledge gaps. Culture being probably one of the biggest ones. It's not necessarily in our DNA. We're going to have to change this slightly to do it. Old-fashioned thinking, yeah. The reality is that when we think about collaboration, it's quite logical to think about, we know what we need to do to be able to do it, but we are very regimented in construction, I think, in terms of this is the way we've always done it, so this is the way it will always be. So I think, yeah, that is a challenge, I think, in terms of creating that behaviour change, that trust culture we need, and we're getting better at it, and there are more projects now that are trying it. Risk avoidance, yeah, that's probably another one of the big ones that we see. And when I do subcontracting training, through the workshops that we do, we talk a lot about risk dumping and where it needs to be at the right place. Okay, so in terms then of the sort of barriers, yeah, you've talked about stakeholders' resistance to change, procurement not having the right training skills, because you've mentioned that. Actually, the fact that, you know, organizations are really, really difficult. It was kind of interesting to see in that video that the lady did, was that actually it's not down to procedures, it's down to people skills and relationships. So actually you might not get the same project people on one project that work really, really well that knowledge is really difficult to then transfer, and those skills are difficult to transfer if you don't take those people with you. So organizations can be big and complex. We don't know where they're coming from. Data you mentioned, so yeah, data related issues are definitely in there. Time and cost will always be a time poor and a cost poor organization or sector, but the reality is that collaboration allows us to maybe extract more time and extract more cost. So it is that sort of cost benefit analysis you need to think about. We do tend to make very big processes and make them very complex. So in my time mainly working in industries like the rail industry, there's been lots of dabbling with lean, having a look at ways that you can really streamline your processes and make them more efficient. And that lack of leadership thing, I think, is really important, is another one of those. Other things to think about are actually about devolved procurement, how we tend to not necessarily have procurement decisions being made at the right place, either at the project level, or they could be centralized, and they have huge challenges around collaboration. So centralized procurement may have lots of ambitions about collaboration. When you get down to the nuts and bolts of procurement, though, it's delivered a project, which means that it might not necessarily have those behaviors, or vice versa. The other thing to think about is lack of transparency at the beginning of the bid stage. So when you're getting the information through from your clients, or you're sending your information through to your supply chain, are you giving them enough information on how to collaborate, so that they can identify areas and opportunities? So what was quite interesting with that Prosa video was this sort of earlier contractor involvement was so key. So how do we overcome some of those barriers? Well, apart from trying to tell everybody to behave and get on, I suppose there's a lot more we can do. So trying to look at this lowest cost mentality is really important. So understanding where we're linking lowest price to something that fundamentally then can affect the success of the project. I had this on one of the things that I was doing, a vegetation contract that had been let before I got there. It was actually the lowest cost vegetation contract. When we tried to look at all the requirements we needed around habitat creation or waste diversion, none of that had been built in, which meant that actually we were going to fail for our clients in terms of some of the delivery that we needed. So making sure that we don't focus on lowest cost all the time. There might be some areas where cost is key, but in other areas, if cost is actually reduced at the sacrifice of a successful delivery, we have to challenge everybody on that. And as procurement, we have a role to play on that. Engaging with the right stakeholders, so going back to that idea we had with the A14, challenging behaviours, making sure everybody understands what we are trying to do. And I think one of the most underrated elements of collaborative behaviours is emotional intelligence. It sounds like a buzz phrase, but it is about understanding, the impact of behaviours, the impact of activity, and what it does to influence people's perception of what leadership is doing, and what actually you mean when you say one thing but behave in a different way. So the emotional intelligence is really, really important. And obviously, as procurement people, if we've got procurement people on the call, we have a massive role to play in terms of telling people what the benefits of collaboration are. The reality is that in a lot of cases, a lot of procurement people I know, they know the benefits. It's just trying to convince other people that it's a good idea and it's not just about cost. Process. Procurement is complex in our industry. So to a certain extent, we have a natural bent to some collaboration, because we do have a process that is complex, that relies significantly on supply chain engagement. But we also sort of historically can over-bureaucratize, make it very bureaucratic. She says, trying to get her teeth in. So what we need to do is make sure that we do find ways to streamline that procurement process, take away the barriers that mean that, if we want to collaborate with other suppliers, what are we doing around pre-qualification to encourage the right people to come into our supply chain? What are we doing to ensure that we're selecting them then with the right behaviours, that they're aligned with what we're doing? And then data. We keep talking about data, but the reality is that a lot of what our future world looks like in construction is now around data, technology, skills. We have to be investing in making sure that we're getting the right people, the right digital skills, the right soft emotional skills. It's not just about procurement skills now in terms of understanding how to do a contract or how to understand to run a tender. There's a lot more now that we need to really focus on. So the last bit then is just to give you an idea of why this does work and where it has worked quite well. So when you get this slide deck, you can click on this link and read the case study in more detail. But just a quick overview of a project that ran for the Environment Agency. So it was the 5.2 billion capital programme. And as part of that, what they did was they established something called the NGSA, the Next Generation Supply Arrangements. And they put collaborative delivery frameworks in place. So that was partnering up Environment Agency and delivery partners together to really get involved in the design of the new flood investment programs, or the flood barrier investment programs. Interesting thing in here is two key things that they've identified. The word partners is quite important when we talk about collaborative cultures, making people feel that they are part of the conversation. Small psychology, but making them feel like they're coming along for the ride and getting involved and bringing something important to the table. And they created a series of shared programs and goals and objectives, which were actually agreed by all key partners. When they undertook this program, things didn't always work well, and some lessons that they learned from it was that procurement was quite important. The idea that if we're really going to get a truly collaborative supply chain, one size does not fit all, which sometimes from a procurement perspective really starts to cause us some issues. We tend to like to have a standardized approach, but there needs to be some flexibility to what's the capability of the supply chain? Do they understand what we need to deliver? Do we need to engage with them, train them on key collaborative techniques and tools? And do we need to build trust with them? And there may be some that you do more than others. So the procurement process, the routes, the things that you do with them will be very flexible. But to do that, what you need to do is also understand what the market has the capability to do. So where are the trends? Where can we collaborate? Where do we need to invest our time and energy? Where can we just find something more simple, use standardized approach? So the market trends and knowledge is really important. And one thing that was kind of interesting was that the Environment Agency also came back from this saying, actually, what we also know is we need to be flexible as a client. So we need to make sure that we're dedicating as a client resources that are supportive. So in some industries, in construction, I'm seeing this more and more in things like the highways types of contracts that are out there. People like the Environment Agency, to a certain extent, Network Rail. Other areas of construction, like homes, for example, slowly starting to come in. So we're starting to see a huge variation in terms of client maturity in this area. So finally, why this works quite well, there were some really interesting benefits. So they found that, funnily enough, they were able to deliver these flood barrier investment programs to time and to budget. So tight margins are an issue, but sometimes tight margins become tight because we don't run projects efficiently and effectively. So collaboration can find ways to be able to help us with those margins. There was also reduced delivery risk. Every organisation understood what the risks were. They were able to address them up front and also identify where there were opportunities. So because you're collaborating and everybody understands their role, they found that they were reducing their risk quite significantly. They found that what they ended up with was quite a strong internal and supplier alignment. They ended up with a model that was actually allowed to be flexible, so they were able to address, obviously, as we know with government projects, fluid funding models that come in and some of the challenges around that. And things like, and I think the Prater example was a great one, and they had the same thing here, being able to respond to incidences and deal with supply chains effectively was a great one. Led to cost savings, and actually they were able to define value in this situation as CO2 reduction. So they were able to find ways to do that. So there were some really good benefits to creating this collaborative arrangement. And then finally, what this ended up doing was on the case study, you'll see a lot more information around some of the challenges that they had. But there's some really interesting sort of quotes there from two of the key individuals that were working on the projects. And again, extracting all the key things that we've just talked about over the last sort of 40 minutes around alignment of goals, clear lines of communication, flexibility to address decisions quickly, and actually raising the bar, really starting to make sure that procurement really starts to drive some of those values going forward. So before I open up the questions, I've got no questions at the moment, but if you want to put them in, basically the key things when we're thinking about collaborative behaviours is most of it comes down to behaviour change. Collaboration really does come down to the fact that we need to challenge those key behaviours. There are tools, training, technology, process shifts. They are important too. They can support that behaviours piece. But the key is about that. The barriers are pretty traditional. You've got the traditional ones in terms of lack of communication, lack of trust. We know these things go on. And obviously we are starting to see more and more issues around supply chain. So when you're looking at this, the real key thing is to understand where the problem truly lies if you're not being collaborative. Is it a process? Is it behaviours? What do you need to do to address that? We have got an e-learning module that goes into this and goes into some of the case studies a bit more. So again, if you click on that link, then that's quite important. You'll be able to get access to that. But in the meantime, it's a question of, can we get your feedback? So I believe the feedback form will either be in the chat, or alternatively we'll be sending it around. And it's really key that we get this going forward to make sure that we're looking at the right subjects for you. But any questions? Any thoughts from anybody, anything that they would like to understand a little bit more? Or is it, I've had enough, Helen, I want to go and carry on with my day? All quiet. Okay, so you get 10 minutes of your day back, which I know sometimes, oh no, hang on, I've got a question in my chat. Oh, thank you. Toby's put very kindly the feedback form into the chat box. So if you've done that, can you please click on that link and complete before you leave? That is really, really important. However, if there are no questions, then my name's Helen Carter. It's been a pleasure sort of talking at you for the last 50 minutes. Hopefully you found something useful, something to inspire you. Some really good links in there to go and have a look at, some good videos to go and research a little bit more if you want to use those. But in the meantime, thank you and enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you, everybody.